Hello, my friends. This is Dr. M here with you to support your journey of principles of economics. And what we're going to talk to you today is what really determines the full economy of employment. Essentially, I just gave you a little peek on employment output and real wages. In particular, if you wanted to think through what really matters on macroeconomic level for any policymaker, you can summarize this concern in terms of employment that we discussed, output that we also talked about, and real wages as we visited. So now I'm going to combine all those three, and I will try to introduce a model that will encompass all of it in one. So that's going to be a challenge for us, but we'll try to overcome this. Realistically, in addition to the labor, people also use capital. And as we move through this presentation, I want you to keep in mind that somewhere on the background there is capital that is held constant. And we have to keep this in mind because the amount of capital can shift and bring some of the changes in our presentation model. So the question that we want to start with, what really determines the level of employment, output, and real wages? Because those are the three that are critically important to consider. So what we need to do is to understand the essence of each. Production possibility frontier. Production possibility frontier essentially allows you to measure the maximum of output that can be produced with a given number of inputs. And I think you will find it helpful if I were to go to my notepad here, and I will show you a following graph as it relates to production possibility frontier. Let's suppose that we have two inputs, x2 and x1. So the direction is northeast because as you move from the origin further away towards northeast, the more you can produce given input x1 and x2. And if you want, you can call this labor and this capital. So every company is using labor and every company using capital. They combine those two inputs in such a way that would allow them to produce the output. So you can think about this as the level of output 1 or production possibility frontier. Company wants to increase production possibility frontier to the level of output 2, and it wants to move into the direction of northeast to become larger, larger, and larger by introducing more and more output at the expense of introduction of inputs such as labor and capital. Now, one thing that I would like you to keep in mind that the slope of production possibility frontier may change, and it will be by and large dictated how much capital is used versus labor. For example, you can have production possibility frontier that will look like this. And that indicates that this much capital is being used along with this much labor. You can think about as labor has been exported in terms of the services and engaged overseas, then capital was used domestically. It will explain this slope of production possibility frontier. Now, all of a sudden, you can use the same capital and increase the amount of labor. And you see the slope is going to change when you compare production possibility frontier Q1 versus Q2. So slope of production possibility frontier indicates how much of X1 labor you use in relationship to X2 capital. And in reality, this ratio changes over time. It could be dictated by technology. For example, faster computers can demand fewer people to be engaged. So in some companies, IT departments lay off professionals in IT area because they manage to program and automate the production process that requires fewer people. So as you see, it's a very dynamic process, and now you understand what production possibility frontier looks like, and it may have different slope. All right, now we know what production possibility frontier is. Let's continue to dissect what determines the level of employment, output, and real wages. Capital. So what I have in front of you is the marginal product of labor. Basically, it's a change in output divided by the change in labor. That's what you have in front of you. But in reality, you also have similar notion as it relates to capital. So let me go back to the notepad and show that in a little bit more detail. Marginal product of labor can be calculated as the change in total output that comes from production possibility frontier divided by the change in labor holding capital constant, or ceteris paribus condition employed. You can do the same with the marginal product of capital. Change in total output divided by the change in capital. In this case, you will be holding labor constant or invoking ceteris paribus condition. So, production possibility frontier depends upon marginal product of labor and marginal product of capital. Because we are holding capital constant as we determine our relationship as it relates to employment output and real wages, we will zoom on marginal product of labor. So now I will assume that you understand the marginal product of labor and how it's calculated each time we're going to use this throughout presentation. Okay, we just talked about marginal product of labor and marginal product of labor. Now let's bring into this picture the wage rate. The wage rate should be considered in this discussion because individual that has a certain productivity, and in essence you are watching this video, you are taking this class because you want to enhance your marginal product of labor. You want to be more efficient with your intellectual capacity, with your capacity to process information that is so increasingly demanded by a variety of firms. And thus, you are doing it, for the most part, in the name of the real wage rate. Remember from the previous discussion we talked about nominal versus real. Nominal is a dollar value of the wage rate that can take you purchase things at the marketplace. The real wage rate actually takes away the price fluctuation from this approach. So what I have in front of you is the slide marginal product of labor as it either greater than real wage rate, equal real wage rate, or less than real wage rate. Let's think through very carefully what that means before we proceed to the graphical presentation. So let me go back to our notepad in order to think through this issue together. So marginal product of labor is greater than the wage rate, real wage rate. What does it mean? It basically implies that on the left-hand side you have a marginal product of labor, or your productivity per se, and on the right-hand side the value of this productivity. If at the marketplace at any time your marginal product of labor exceeds the real wage rate, that makes person who brings the marginal product of labor to the marketplace very unsatisfied, very unhappy. And this is the point when people become very unhappy with that equation. They start their own business because they are not satisfied how much they get paid in relationship to what they can do. They see that they can do more than the market is willing to compensate them for. That's when people leave the job at the firm, or they start their own business. So that's the first one. The second one to consider is when marginal product of labor is less than real wage rate. What does that mean? In this case, you are looking at the marginal product of labor that is compensated significantly higher at the marketplace. So it's paraphrasing, your worthwhile productivity is overvalued by the marketplace. Your company pays you more than you are worth in terms of the productivity. And in this case, the company is at loss because it will lose the money by paying you more than it should given the market conditions. So you see, in the first case, employee is unhappy and looking for the way out from this arrangement. On the second case, employer is unhappy and looking for the way out from this situation. And finally, the best case scenario is when marginal product of labor is identical to the real wage rate. That's when everybody is happy. This is where equilibrium takes place. You are basically compensated as much as you are worth at the marketplace. So keep that in mind, because that triggers people making decisions when they start their own business, when they fight for the chance to stay at the company, or when the company is trying to find a way to get rid of the employee. So the trick for you and myself and everybody else who is at the marketplace is to figure out a way making sure that your marginal product of labor keeps up with the real wage rate that you get paid. Otherwise, you run into the conflicts. So that translates into job security or insecurity, employment and unemployment, and of course, the output. All right. The next thing that we can do, we can look at the graphical presentation, and at that point, we can finish this presentation. So what I have in front of you is 3 different graphs. I'm putting together employment output and real wages as intrinsic parts and interrelated parts. On the top graph, you have quantity versus leisure. Let me explain this relationship. It's a negative relationship. Explanation starts like this. In order for you to produce something, an output, you must provide labor. It takes labor to produce the output. Now, initially, we considered that it takes also capital. But I also mentioned to you that we are going to hold capital constant. So keep the capital on the back burner as a part of ceteris paribus condition. But it takes labor in this case to produce the output. Now, where do you get labor? Labor comes from giving up leisure. So right now I'm presenting this video material because I gave up leisure in order to produce the output. Output is this video lecture that came at the expense of my leisure. So that's why the output and leisure are inversely related, my friends. Moving on towards to the right. Now you have the quantity versus labor. That is positive relationship. And this relationship between quantity and labor is often described as the production function. In the literature, it's called production function. When you see the production function definition, you start thinking about the relationship between output and labor. And it has to be a positive relationship. You see how those 2 graphs are interrelated. Because output does not just depend upon leisure or labor, but both. And taste for leisure and taste for labor and preferences as well. For example, if in Europe they have greater taste and preference for leisure than in the United States, then they will be more reluctant to give up leisure, and that will translate in less output. And the same with labor versus quantity. Now on the bottom graph you have marginal product of labor is related to the labor. Essentially, it's an inverse relationship. As you increase your labor hours, your marginal productivity at some point will be declining at increasing rate. For instance, there is only so much you can get in terms of the output as you provide more hours of labor. At some point you need to have a break, you need to rejuvenate, you need to sleep, you need to eat, and you need to restore the energy that you spend providing labor. So thus increasing labor at the margin will diminish your marginal product of labor at some point and at increasing rate. And that's an interesting proposition because for someone who is in elementary school, to get through this presentation would be excruciatingly hard. And for someone who is at the university, it becomes very doable proposition, although not without challenges. So at this point, I would like to stop this video and we'll come back to finish this presentation. Thank you for your time, my friends.